Hi, guys. Welcome to Real Food Recovery. We have another exciting episode today. But before I hop into that, I must say hello to my partner, Jamie. How's it going, friend?
Doing well, doing well. This is an interesting topic here today. I'm excited to dive into it.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. And we are going to be talking about our future self. So, if you can imagine a future where you are free from the grip of processed or ultra processed foods, where your health is vibrant and your mind is clear, this vision isn't just a dream, it's a reality that you can work towards starting right now. One of the key steps to achieving this is mastering impulse control. Impulse control is our ability to resist short term temptations in favor of long term goals. When you're recovering from processed food addiction, this can feel incredibly challenging. The urge to reach for that bag of chips or a sugary snack can be overwhelming. But today, we're going to equip you with strategies to strengthen your impulse control by focusing on your future self.
Yes, for those suffering from the effects of processed food, some call it food addiction, obsession, or compulsion, or really any addiction, we heavily rely on constant thoughts of our future self to remain abstinent. Basically, if we want to be successful and live without regret, we make all our decisions with our future self in mind. In fact, RFR has cracked the code for recovering from the effects of processed foods. So we invite you all to listen up here. It's simply that recovery maturity is the application of skills that lead to impulse control. And that puts us
Mhm.
on the path to true freedom.
Agree. At Real Food Recovery, so much of our conversation with our members focus on the long game. We place emphasis on long-term consequences versus immediate gratification. So the question becomes, do you believe that impulse control is the ultimate gift to our future self that leads to the path to recovery?
Yeah, I absolutely think that impulse control is important. I guess um, the bigger question is, what's behind the impulse, right? Is it, what
Mm-hmm.
part of me is behind my impulse? So
Mm-hmm.
if I have a part of my inner family that's running the show, if I have a problem with impulse control, it's typically my inner teen or inner child running the show. And if that's the case, then I know, okay, I have some work to do here with them. It's not really about impulse control as much as it is about connection with my inner family. And if I'm able to
Mm-hmm.
connect with my inner family and figure out what's behind that impulse, then I'm usually able to make more progress. And it's not so much about controlling as it is about discovering and curiosity.
Interesting. Yeah.
Your thoughts
Um,
around this?
Yeah, I absolutely believe for me that impulse control is the key for success for me. It's no different than the lectures I would give my 16-year-old children when they were in high school, or even my toddlers, teaching them not to hit when they're angry. I used to tell my teenagers before they would go out for the evening, bad decisions are like having dice in your hand, shaking around and saying, I'm going to let them go, and I don't it doesn't matter to me what numbers they land on. I'll take whatever happens. There needs to be a filter between thoughts and actions. You might call it a pause button. You know, that big red button that, oh, it's a
Yes.
commercial that, so every
Yep.
time my children reacted in impulse, it inevitably ended up in uncomfortable consequences, not just for them, but for everybody in the room, because your decisions never affect just yourself. And guess what? Every time I buckle to urges, I end up with regret and self-imposed consequences. Then, no matter what, others end up paying for my choices when I'm not my best authentic self. And unfortunately, at my age, I don't have anyone standing over me, forcing my behavior. So as adults, we, good
Mhm.
and bad, get to choose for ourselves. Sometimes maybe that's not the best thing.
I hear you. So how does fear play into your decisions?
Oh, I definitely am a fear-based person. I'm naturally pretty straight arrow. Some call it boring, but straight arrow makes me feel like less of a nerd. So I like to say I'm a straight arrow. I get up on time, I brush my teeth, and floss my teeth twice a day. I take my vitamins, I plan my food in advance and have it on hand and ready to go. I exercise every day. I say my prayers, make my bed, and go to sleep early, and I don't say things to people I don't mean. And I learned early on to study for the test the night before. In fact, I'll tell a story. Last night we had our grandkids over for swimming and dinner, and we were in a rush to take them home. Normally, I get the kitchen cleaned up, and it was late by the time we got back, and I did not want to start. It was like after 8 o'clock, and the kitchen was a mess before we got back. I like to be in bed 8:30, 8:45, but I said to myself, your future self on Monday morning when you wake up is going to thank you so much when you get up. I mean, I did all the dishes, unloaded the dishwasher, put the new stuff in, scrubbed the countertop. So everything was sparkling by the time I went to bed, which cost me another 30 or 45 minutes. But you know what? When I got up this morning, I was like, oh, I'm so glad I did this to start my week, not with a disaster on my hands. I don't like when things are messy. I don't like having to clean up messes. So yes, to be honest, I am a little fear-based. Do you live in fear of consequences, or does that not drive you, motivate your decisions?
No, it doesn't, I've, because I grew up in a sort of culture of fear and that was the mindset growing up. It was something that I've spent a lot of years trying to unravel. So I
Ah,
don't necessarily live in fear of consequences, um, at all. I live in knowledge and acknowledgement of them. Um, and I allow myself to make choices and to understand that those choices have consequences. And if I look back at, let's say that I chose not to clean the kitchen in your situation. If I chose not to clean that kitchen and I woke up the next morning, that would say, and if I was, stressed or pressed for time or resentful, then I have to look at my own decisions and say, okay, you had a decision to make. You made the wrong decision, and what'd you learn? So it's
mm-hmm.
more of a curiosity thing. It's not a fear thing. But again, that's just because there was, fear was what was instilled in me growing up all the time, was always fear, fear, fear. So I'm very, very happy to let those fearful thoughts go and choose curiosity and compassion, and acceptance, even when I know that I'm the one who made the wrong choice, right? Because 99% of the time I am. I have to remind myself that, okay, I made a choice and I have to live with the consequences. And what do I learn?
For those listening, you can tell that Jamie is a little more evolved on the
Not
human emotion scale than me.
necessarily. I just got tired of butting my head against the wall.
Mhm.
And truly the fear fed my anxiety. And I was just so tired of feeling the anxiety. So
So
I had to work on letting that go.
So I love that you brought that up, because I think the fear actually is a positive motivator for me. So I think it depends on the person maybe a
Sure.
little bit,
Yeah.
because and when I say fear, I don't mean like terror. Maybe motivation might be a better word, but yeah, I just don't want to have to deal with the fallout later. So it's uncomfortable enough. The concern is uncomfortable enough that it is a motivator. And it's probably normal for most people to have some level of fear of consequences. It would be scary and
Sure.
dangerous to live in a society that where that wasn't the norm. So
We
that being
kind
the
of
case,
are. We kind of are these days, but I digress.
do
In
you want
some
to
ways.
say do you want to say anything more about it?
No, no, just there are some uh folks that I see, maybe younger generations especially, that it seems that there are no fear of consequences at all.
Yeah,
And that's always
I
interesting
agree.
to me. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they'll learn their lessons too, just like I learned mine.
Right. So, that brings up the question about where is the disconnect between fear and impulse control. If we are truly worried about these long-term effects, why do we ever move forward with such destructive patterns? Jamie, answer that for me. I'd love to know. I'd love to know the answer, please.
Uh, Well, a lot of times it really depends. It depends on how you're wired, right? Some people are wired for an adrenaline, they want a hit of adrenaline. And adrenaline, we get a hit of adrenaline when we do something that's risky, right? And risky
Yeah.
might mean when we take a gamble or we do roll the dice, there's risk involved with that. And if it works out, it's like it's a flood of dopamine, right? A flood of neurotransmitters that, positive, unfortunately, neurotransmitters when gambles that we take pay off. And when gambles that we take don't pay off, right? It's also a flood of negative neurotransmitters. So either way, we sort of get addicted to that chance taking process in some ways. I think especially younger people who don't have a recognition of those pathways yet, and then see how their body and brains sort of vibe that way.
Mhm.
But for me, as I got older, I realized that I didn't want to take a gamble, or I didn't want to leave it up to chance, that I wanted to know what I was doing, and that what I was doing was going to have a not a negative outcome, maybe not a positive outcome, right? Because I'm not God, but hopefully not a negative outcome. That's, preventing negative outcomes seemed like a very good opportunity for me most of the time.
Yeah, that's funny that you said that about younger people, maybe less fear of consequences. I just happened to see a video on Facebook today or someplace where this young man was scaling this straight up side of the mountain, just literally straight up, but it was just like with fingers and toes. No, they weren't using ropes or anything. And this was a
Crazy,
huge, tall thing. That kid
crazy.
was not afraid of consequences. I mean, that would have scared me to death. So one false
Yeah,
move, man. Well, you only make it once.
that's right.
Um,
Good point.
so I think this is such a good question. You might even call it the $1,000,000 question. I think, as
Mhm.
you pointed out, I think it's the immature mind is at a disadvantage because we know that our brains aren't fully developed till they're in their 20s. But
Well
as
in their
a
20s, the 28,
oh yeah, later
well in
for
their 20s.
men, earlier for women. But yeah, so when you're when you're teenagers, you ask them something, they say, I don't know why I did that. They really do mean they don't know.
They
They
really
truly,
don't. They
they,
really don't know.
but sometimes as adults we continue to struggle. And then if you add addiction into the mix, and you have a real mess on your hands. And sadly, we know that our frontal lobe holds the logic center, rational
That's true.
thought, long-term consequences, the braking system. So then when we have that and we're exposed to cues and triggers and cravings, that blood flow rushes to that center brain where the addiction center is housed, and we're left unprotected. Physiologically, it's literally working against us. So I have felt that brain shift when I'm in
Mhm.
a highly cueing environment. It's almost like I can hear the wind go whoosh right in my ears. And I really have to start in with self-talk. I even have this little trick, and many of you have heard me or seen me say, I put my hands on my cheeks and I say, "You're okay. You're okay. You're okay." And sometimes just those words can help calm me down and bring the blood flow back where it needs to be, and get a hold of myself. It's interesting to compare when I'm calm and not being triggered. I have zero problem making good future self decisions. It's really easy for me
Mhm.
to make healthy choices when I'm calm, but when I'm not, it's like, now why am I doing this? What, I literally can't form a sentence sometimes.
Yeah, and that's true. Like, remember that's all about where the blood flow is, right? Where the blood flow, so does our sort of energy. So if our blood flow is back to the amygdala, which is that emotional seat of the brain, um, that is all around, fight or flight. It's all around, making some huge pain relieving decision. Really, it's about relieving pain, relieving anxiety, relieving pressure, relieving some kind of discomfort. So whatever we can do, that amygdala is driving it, we're going to do, and it's probably going to have some kind of negative consequence. But
Mhm,
if we stop and remember that the blood flow is in the amygdala and it's an emotional decision, not a rational decision, uh,
mhm,
that is the whole idea is, okay, let's stop and say, okay, I am making a decision to relieve discomfort, to relieve pain, to take myself to, out of this place that I'm in emotionally. Then that's an indicator that, okay, we're not in our frontal lobe. So we have to figure out, right, that in order to make the decisions that we want to stick with the rest of our lives, we have to be back in that frontal lobe. So whatever we can do to get us into that present moment and take us out of that fight or flight scenario where you're overthinking, very quickly making decisions, very quickly um, weighing options and trying to figure out which one's less painful. if anything feels frazzled, if anything feels pushed, if anything feels energetically like there's a lot of momentum, you're probably in your amygdala. And it's really
Mhm,
important to stop and say, okay, I'm probably going to make a decision that has negative consequences here. I don't want to make that.
mhm,
So stop and take a deep breath. That helps get you centered, right? It works to get me centered every time. It might even be a few deep breaths, right? Box breathing, something like that, where you're just focusing on counting and breathing and being present in your body. And then at that point, you can ask yourselves those questions, yourself the question, what do you really want? What do you need right now? What can you
mhm,
do to make it happen? What are you really hungry for? Those kinds
mhm,
of things really help.
mhm. Yeah, I love this conversation, and I want to talk a little bit about first discovering that you can actually have the option to control impulses. That is a huge pivotal moment in your life in recovery when we learn that we aren't just a victim to these urges. For me, I have fought sugar addiction for as long as I can remember. I loved it, loved everything about it. I was never happier than when I was eating sugar until I wasn't. But starting in my teenage years, I had to try and figure out how to control these out of control episodes because up until then I had been rail thin. So it wasn't really even a concern to me. But as I began to develop, I became more aware of the connection between sugar binges and puberty curves. Hence, began the search for the perfect diet as a young girl. And that pattern would plague me for another 40 years of jumping from diet to diet to diet. Talk about painful existence. A decade ago, I thought switching to plant-based sweeteners was the ticket, so that helped, but I would still have those out of control episodes once or twice a month. I didn't understand that even plant-based sweeteners kept the cravings alive. It wasn't until I ditched the diets. I will, everybody listen. I will never, ever, ever go on another diet again, and you don't have to either. Plant-based sweeteners, I ditched plant-based sweeteners and I switched to a recovery program with single ingredient whole foods and then I began to discover these tools to help with impulse control, plus a big emphasis on doing a lot of the work up front. We talk a lot of that about pre-working your life so that things can fall in to place. And that was a big discovery for me. For example, cleaning the kitchen the night before was a is one of my tools. I always make sure the kitchen's clean before I go to bed. I try to keep the food out, the processed food out of my sight, those types of things, doing work up front. So once I had my first success at a family gathering, I had this switch flip in my brain and I had just experienced something very new in my late 50s. I was no longer a victim. I had built on that experience and I have never looked back. I knew I had it in me then to beat this for the first time. I mean, that was such a huge moment in my life. I never knew that that was possible before. I always thought it was bigger than I could manage because I mean, I loved sugar that much. I mean, if I had to be left on a deserted island between Tom Selleck and chocolate chip cookies, I would have chose chocolate chip cookies. I loved sugar that much, but that level of freedom has changed my life and it can change yours too. So now when a craving hits, instead of reacting impulsively, I take a moment to pause, acknowledge the craving, understand that it's temporary. That was another big aha for me too, that these cravings are temporary. And then I can choose a response that supports my future self. Jamie, did you have like this big first aha that you realize I can control this? I don't have to just have a thought and react.
Uh,
I can have
yeah,
I'm rowing my own boat here.
yeah. I just want to pause and comment on you talking about, was it Tom Selleck and chocolate chip cookies?
Do you
Yeah.
think I'm kidding? I'm not kidding.
No, I'm laughing because my husband sent me a, a a recording today of like an old Golden Girls episode.
Uh-huh.
And when I think about Tom Selleck, I don't know why, probably because maybe this whole mustache thing. I think about Burt Reynolds and like, so he
Yeah.
sent me this whole thing from the Golden Girls, which is like my probably favorite old time sitcom,
Oh, yeah.
which by the way, he never has watched really ever, which is mind boggling that I married this man and he's never watched an episode of Golden Girls, but I digress. And so we watched, so he sent me this thing where Burt Reynolds is like making a cameo on the Golden Girls, and he
Oh,
knocks on the door to pick up Sophia, the grandma, for a date. And they're just fawning. The other three are fawning over Burt
oh,
Reynolds,
that's hysterical.
and he says, "Oh, are these your roommates you told me about, Sophia?" And she said, "Yep, that's them." And he said, "Which one is the easy one?" But he didn't use that phrase. He used another word that I probably, until today's political climate, don't need to say. And they all raised their hand. They're like, "I am." At the same time, it was so funny. So anyway, you made me think of Burt Reynolds. But
By the way, Tom Selleck, I'm talking about the Magnum PI days for anybody my age,
I
not
get
the Hill Street Blues or no Blue Bloods. But
Oh yeah, no. I watched Blue Bloods. I can't see it anymore. But
I
I could see the Magnum. I
know.
could see it in the Friends era too. I could see it in the Friends era. I could see
Oh
what was
yeah,
happening there.
he still had it then. We
Yeah.
we digress. What were we talking about?
Yeah.
What are we?
Maybe we'll get him on the podcast.
That's funny.
Seriously, Tom Selleck, if you're listening.
So yeah, what's your first aha moment that you could beat this thing, that you could have impulse control?
When I realized that I was master of my own ship, right? Master of my own domain, that nobody
Yeah,
was doing anything to me. Nobody was holding me down and force feeding me anything. And that I realized it was like this victim mindset that was unfortunately taught
yeah,
to me, that I was able to start shedding. It was
yeah.
very freeing.
Oh, I mean, is there any better feeling than discovering you actually have control over your actions when it comes to food? For me, I felt like I had discovered a whole new world. I had my life back, and it had just gotten better and better as these years have passed over these past 3.5 years. Not perfect. I'm not perfect, but much, much better. I can go on vacation, be at family gatherings, or simply go out to dinner without fear of the sugar temptations. I still work on all the other areas of my recovery, but the sugar, for the most part, in general, I have that one down. Jamie, do you feel like that empowerment has spilled over into other areas of your life as well? Basically, increased your confidence in other areas now that you know what you're capable of? I mean, if I can do this, for me, I was thinking I can do anything. So I didn't know if that affected you that way too, if it has washed over the rest of your life, knowing did it change your confidence in other areas, basically?
Oh, for sure. Yes, for sure. And that would be why I was able to start to have like the self-assurance and more direction in my life. And so it really was how, that empowerment began to bleed from my lifestyle to my career, to my finances, to my relationships. Probably relationships was the last one for me that it you sort of bled into.
Oh, that's interesting.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
It was always so crazy to me because I was this ultra controlled person. I mean, type A, type triple A in every area of my life. But this one thing, when I say I had zero control, that's what I thought.
Mm.
So also, I'm realizing as I'm saying this out loud is because I think it, then so it is. So if I thought I had zero control, then I made that true, just that self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And
Yeah, I did the same thing for a long time.
yeah, were you going around saying, I can beat this, this is no problem?
Yeah,
It's
no.
just like, see a cookie, eat the cookie. There was no space there's no thought. It was just literally a robotic reaction when I was cued and triggered with sugar.
Yes.
Um, and I literally couldn't figure out what was happening. I really just thought it was a willpower thing and I was the only one affected. And not to mention, there had not been a ton of discussion on this topic until recently. I don't even think we understood fully what was happening and that food actually fits the criteria for an actual addiction. We now understand it has nothing to do with willpower. And so when I thought it had to do with willpower, I just was in the cycle of beating myself up and being ashamed of how weak I was and because then it sets you up, how can I hide eating this? And I want 10 cookies and everyone else in the room had one cookie, and it was embarrassing. But I was in so much pain, I had to stop the pain. I was in so much pain, I didn't care what anybody else thought about me because the pain was greater than worrying about what people thought of me. Does that make
Yes.
sense? So people that have
Mhm.
weight struggles, really, they don't have a
Yeah.
weight problem, they have an addiction problem. In the book, The Pleasure Trap, they say that our society sets us up to be fat, sick, and miserable. And I believe that.
Mhm. Yeah. I totally get it. And that's it's important to understand that a lot of these issues weren't really present until like the 50s and 60s and 70s. And again,
Mm,
that's when the transition from big tobacco went to big food. You know, over the
yeah.
weekend, I actually had a day yesterday when I haven't had in, oh my gosh, months and months, where I had most of the day to myself.
Mm,
I slept very late, very long, which wasn't really planned, but my body obviously needed it. And when I finally got myself moving, I did what I had to do for my morning chores, and then I just sat in front of the TV and just picked
nice.
movie that I wanted to watch, and it was just quiet in the house. It was glorious.
Nice.
And um, the first movie I picked was, I won't even mention the name because I don't even want to give it any press, but it was really just a whole story about the junk food industry, and in this case, it was the cereal industry that was creating a new product back in the 60s and how they created it. And it was a movie, so it was like a dramatized version of the story. And all it was, I mean, I watched maybe 10 minutes of it, but all it was a big, huge commercial for big food. And it
Mm.
was just exploiting big food. And I just was like, and all these like top tier actors were in this movie.
Really?
And I'm just like, oh my, like it is so clearly a huge commercial for big
Mm-hmm.
food. And it was very, very high production value. I mean, the whole thing was just, I'm like, they must have paid so much. Like, it just tells you like how much they're losing, right? Because they're willing to finance a whole entire production
Good point.
to tell their story about their
Mm-hmm.
early years of food processing. Like, it's so ridiculous. Anyway, I just it's important to understand, right, that this whole play, right, between the companies that formulate these products that make them addictive. And the few minutes I did watch of the movie before I turned it off for something else was really just how they were formulating the stuff. I mean, they were very transparent in the movie about how they were formulating the products to be literally addictive to these children that they were trying to market to.
Ah,
P.S. It was not like the company names were, Schmellogs and Most. It was like the company names were all over
really?
the, yeah. So it was very clear, like it was very transparent and sad, very sad.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I know that those companies do formulate those foods with the highest amount of sugar, salt, and oil.
Yeah,
Yeah, sugar, oil, and salt. Yeah.
yeah.
It's disgusting. Totally
Yeah,
disgusting.
you're right.
And
But to your point, when I realized that, right, it did give me a lot of freedom. It did give me a lot of peace to know that, again, not the addiction side of it, but once I was able to understand, hey, like they're really victimizing the people that they're making money off of. That was empowering because I was able to say, oh, I don't want to be a victim of this
yeah,
food propaganda and marketing propaganda and chemical propaganda. I don't want to be a victim of it. And I find myself still like it's very easy for me to push that stuff out, right? And not even think of it as real food. But they've gotten so smart now. And so I would say conniving in how they market, right? They market their stuff under health halos and other things.
I know.
So I really have to be, if I'm buying something processed, it's just something I need to just leave on the shelf because even if it says that it has this health halo or healthy ingredients or it's minimal ingredients or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it's chances are the company that's marketing on that box is owned by one of these huge big food
Yeah.
conglomerates.
Yeah. And especially sad that the children are so affected because each generation is going to get worse. and worse and worse. I just can't imagine the health crisis that's going to come from just
I
a few
think we'll
more
have a turnaround.
generations.
I really do think. I
You
think we'll
think
have a
it'll turn
turnaround.
around?
I really don't
We'll
think.
have to be,
I
right?
think
If we want to
yes.
continue on
Yeah.
the earth. Yeah. I
Exactly. And I think people will see it. And I think it'll be like smoking and cigarettes in a few years.
I hope so. From
I
your
really
lips to God's ears. I really, it has to be, because we're going to be in such a major health crisis. We'll have no choice to do that. So for me, when I kind of found out about all this, I really wanted to shout it from the rooftops and literally pull everyone I knew into the lifeboat. I don't know if you had that moment where you had this reckoning of what's going on, if you had a moment of, I need to do something about this. Did you? What was your
yeah, I
feelings like when you,
probably became a little too vocal, right, to anyone who would listen. But and so I probably alienated some people in my life just because it was like, I was on my it appeared like I was on my soapbox, but I was really just excited to share what I learned with the village.
yeah, I actually, when I found out about it, I was grateful, and that someone around me was sharing it. So I guess
Mhm.
you have to know your audience, but
True.
I mean, I found it so compelling. I just assume everybody else would too. But I was like you, I just wanted to tell everybody I knew about
Yeah,
this
it's hard not
story.
to.
Yeah, why isn't this on the news every night?
Right.
I mean, I just think it's such a big story. And
Question.
it's funny that when Jamie and I started our podcast, I never dreamed we would be starting an online food addiction recovery community, but our desire to help people just naturally morphed into this entire group of people who focus solely on their future selves. You might even say that helping others with their future helps each of us with our future selves. Do you agree with that, Jamie?
Yes, for sure. Yeah. That's something that I think about all the time, right? That whole shifting, right, of how I've, gone from the thought process I had before for years to the thought process I have now. And it's the whole idea of shifting, that shifting in the brain to think about long-term consequences
Mhm.
instead of immediate gratification. So I stop and think about who do I want to show up as, right, in the future, not just right now. It
Yeah.
works every time for me.
It's, yeah, it's a guarantee, isn't it? When we stay in that future mindset, it's a guarantee
Well
to
said.
be the best human we can be. I remember working with someone who was confronted with a tempting food decision, and she said she literally just stopped and stood there. I think it was in front of a donut box, and there was one donut left in the box. And she said, I thought through 10 steps down the road from where what was getting ready to happen in that exact moment. And that has always stuck with me. And it made me realize just pausing and stopping in your tracks, if you're able to, is certainly one way to protect ourselves. Basically, it's easier not to take that first bite than to try and stop a train that has left the station. And by the way, there is greatness in the power of the pause. But one thing to note is you don't have to decide ahead of time what that pause will look like. Or I should say, you do need to decide ahead of time, what does that pause look like? What specific thing will you do during that pause? I think I remember you talking to one of our members who had talked about pausing, and you said, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Break it down for me. I'm like, that's brilliant. That's simply brilliant. So it might sound silly, but this is where the real work comes in, breaking down the exact action, literally a
Well,
mental of, yeah, go ahead, go ahead and tell us more about what that looks like, what a pause looks
it's the
like.
whole idea of, when we pause, right? When we pause, we have a moment to bring ourselves to the present. And that's really what's important. That's really what it comes down to, stopping and looking at your thoughts and bringing yourself into the present moment instead of future tripping or worrying about the past, right?
Mhm,
And we also focus heavily on setting up our environments for success. And that
mhm.
starts with keeping our house clean of temptations, having clean food on hand for your next meal, thinking ahead through your day, having plan A and B, joining a
Yep.
recovery group such as RFR, working with stress management, getting plenty of sleep, exercise, and tapping into your spiritual side. And really, it takes practice, right? And
Yeah.
consistent practice day after day. It's not
Day
hard.
after day.
Consistency is key. and just never giving up, right? Just being consistent with it. I mean, I make it sound kind of trivial because it kind of is when you really look, just be consistent, just do something towards this every day and you'll get better at it.
I like that you said that because it's not like this is some big complicated system to work on recovery, but the difference between winning and losing, I think is you just said the big key. It's consistency of being willing to show up each day and do it. So it's not hard, but it does take consistent work and not everybody wants to do that. They want to do a check mark and be done with it. That's not what recovery is. It's
Mm,
and I don't know about you, but I'm grateful that I'm never done. I don't ever want to ease up on the gas pedal. That's a scary
agreed.
place for me. So, a few
Agreed.
more things. Some people do tapping, meditation, as well as taking a look at our inner family and see if we can get those parts of us to help us out. We know that no one has ever hated themselves into recovery. We have to have a lot of self-love and self-compassion for this dreadful disease. Like anything in life, we want to achieve. And we have to focus on the future if we want to be successful. As adults, we do what we do for how we feel after.
True, true. One helpful tool is to write out exactly how you envision your results coming to fruition. So you can write out how you're going to show up in the morning after, those safe choices. You can come into a group support and talk about that. You can really begin to examine different tools and discover which ones speak the loudest to your
Mhm.
brain, right? It might be recovery writing, it might be, again, group support, it might be prayer, meditation, it might be working with a coach one-on-one. We try to prioritize our relationship with our future self. It may be the most important relationship you will ever have. Everything we do is trying to minimize regret in our lives.
Agree. We know that living in a future self mindset takes a lot of work, consistent work, you might say, but we believe it's worth it. The workload becomes more manageable with practice. Don't you agree, Jamie? It becomes more
Oh,
manageable
yeah.
with practice. I always like to ask myself, how do I want to feel in the morning? Many an evening when I'm like, ooh, I got the binges coming on. I'm like, I'm going to be so happy tomorrow morning. And you know what? I always wake up and I'm very happy and I didn't die. I had a good night's sleep and I woke up a much happier person. I like waking up with a smile on my face. I've even heard the thought that if it's a good idea now, it's going to be a good idea tomorrow. So let's just wait till tomorrow and decide. Jamie, do you have one key thing that you do to help yourself in that moment to tap into the future? Because that's not an easy thing. So sometimes it takes a little skill of finding what works best for
Um,
you.
I really just I pause. I've just pause and remind myself of where I am and what my goal is, and I really just try to bring myself into the present. It really is
The
that
self-talk.
is the present, and then I'm able to think about the future.
Yeah. Self-talk, that's probably the biggest one for me too. If I just peel it back to the basic layer, it's just having a conversation with yourself.
Mhm,
So I agree with you. Let's talk about what the biggest benefits are to tapping into that future self lifestyle.
mhm. I think for sure is to look at your overall health, right, and well-being, and what your vision is for what you want your health to be, right? And that could be the first step of getting with a doctor or clinician and getting just overall blood work done and overall lab work done to understand where you are, snapshot of where you are today. And if you know that you have some conditions and you're being treated already, then it's about understanding, okay, I have an opportunity to continue to refine. I mean, if it's type 2 diabetes, if it's even autoimmune, there are so many things that are reversible or manageable with diet that don't need medication. There are
I
so many
agree.
things.
Another one is finances. Jamie and I were just happened to be having a conversation about this before we started recording about the cost of having a food addiction. Well, any addiction, but for us, we're talking about food addiction, just the cost of the food, the cost of the gas to get there, the cost of time away from work, the cost of buying new clothes. I mean, the finances, that's no joke. That does matter when
Mhm.
you are fighting ultra processed food.
Yes. We want to make sure that we align to our values, right? Understanding what our personal values are and living to them is very, very important.
Mhm. And we've talked about spirituality too. We believe that spirituality is one of our cornerstones of recovery. And I've had this thought many times about if I'm in the middle of a binge or trying to fight a binge, I don't have access to that spiritual component part of my life. It seems to just mute that feeling right there. And I don't like having not having direct access to my higher power. And so if I'm in the middle of a binge, I just want to be in the fetal position. And so it really does rob me from that inner peace that I need so desperately from that spiritual side of my life.
Yeah, and mental health is the next one. Mental health is a huge component of any processed food, right? I know that for me, if I have even a little bit of the higher sugar fruits, I'll notice that I get down and depressed and anxious, and it's just not worth
Mm.
it at all.
Mhm.
And that's something to, really keep in mind, how do you want to show up in life? And even
Yeah.
the people that I work with, I can tell, in my 9 to 5 job, I can tell that they are, um, driven by processed foods, addictive foods, especially caffeine there, or maybe energy drinks. They are just, there's a few folks that I work with that are like wired at certain times, and it's hard to work with them because they're talking a mile a minute. They're jumping all over the place. It's like herding cats to have a conversation with them, and I know it's because they're using an addictive substance.
Yeah, that makes me think about do you see people show up differently after lunch? I'm not in the corporate world like Jamie is, but I don't know
Mm.
if
Yeah, people comment. I don't know. I'm not with them in person, so but they
yeah.
comment. They'll make comments about it. Yeah.
So another thing that's affected is tapping into that creative side. Um, when you are clean from processed food, you have the bandwidth to think forward and explore your passions. One of our members was talking to her sister about what she was doing in our recovery group, and her sister said, "This is who you really are supposed to be," because this person was in living her recovered life. She said, "When you're off of the addictive foods, you are your true authentic self. And otherwise, if you're in the food, your authentic self gets buried by substance addiction." So I thought that was so profound and so right on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the last one is relationships. So again, this is, important to think about how we show up in our relationships when we're in addictive substances versus how we don't. For me, I show up very irritable, very short, you just not my, not my true self.
Yeah.
So our relationships can be deeply affected. And if anyone thinks the opposite is true, uh, maybe it's time to look closely at your own relationships and think, okay, could I show up differently? And could they be different? Or am I in relationships with people who are eating addictive foods like me? And how different could that relationship be? How much
Oh,
more
good point.
deep and present could the connection be if we didn't use those
Yeah.
substances? So something to think about. All right, so we are moving on to listener questions as we careen towards the end of our show here. We have a couple of questions. Paige, you want to take the first one?
Sure. The first one is I am struggling with the thoughts that how I am now is how I will always be. How do I pull out of that spinning thought? Well, to start, if it's any comfort, you can connect the dots moving backwards and see that you are not the same person as you were 10 years ago. If history is any indicator, you will inevitably continue to progress. Human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished, but we never are. We also know that a desire makes a big impact on future trajectory. Start by setting goals and make measurable steps and don't give up. Find a recovery group that can support you, like Real Food Recovery. In fact, I'll just add that one of our leaders, Shay, was talking this morning about how what's one small thing that you can do this week that might move the needle just a little bit. So just making those small changes can make a very big impact.
Very true. Second question, I want to make changes in my life, but I'm just too weak. Is there any hope? So again, it's this self-talk area, right?
Yes.
We believe our brains believe what we tell it.
Yeah.
So if we're telling our brains we're weak, we assume we're weak. If we're telling our brains we're sick, it assumes we're sick. We tell
Yeah. I don't know if Jamie froze or if I froze, but I will finish by saying that we know that self-talk is the major game changer in how we show up in life. So if we want to make changes in our life, you are never too weak. It's the mental muscle that you need to exercise as far as self-talk that will be the biggest asset in your life. Thank you so much for being here this time, listening to us talk about our future self. And we hope that you will join us again, and you can find out more at realfoodrecovery4u.com. That's the number 4 and the letter U. So thank you again for being here. We hope that you have enjoyed this conversation about future self. And if you have any comments, please feel free to contact us again at realfoodrecovery4u.com. And we hope to see you there. Thanks, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.